Maya Keene had not intended to end up living inside a building that once rattled with the noise of locomotives and carried the smell of coal smoke and grease. But when the city quietly announced the auction of the disused Eastbridge station, she felt a strange pull she could not shake, as if the cracked tiles and weathered beams were calling for someone to remember them. The station had been closed for decades, bypassed when newer lines were laid, and the structure had been sitting in limbo, half demolished in places, with weeds breaking through the platform and pigeons nesting in the rafters. But under the decay, there was still a sense of grandeur. Long arched windows, iron columns riveted together like skeletal trees, faded mosaics with forgotten patterns. As a theatrical set designer, Maya had spent years chasing atmosphere in artificial spaces, painting flats and building cardboard illusions of marble halls, and the idea of transforming an actual historic structure into a living, breathing home struck her as irresistible, even if it meant emptying her savings and trading her city apartment for a drafty ruin on the edge of a neighborhood most people dismissed as a forgotten industrial corridor. When she signed the papers and stepped into the cavernous hall with the official keys, she felt a solemnity that reminded her of entering a theater before a premiere, the moment when the curtain is still down and the silence is thick with expectation. She was alone, and yet not alone, because the walls carried the echoes of all the departures and reunions they had once witnessed. She touched the peeling paint, imagining her grandfather, who had worked on railroads though not here, nodding in approval at her stubbornness. From the very beginning, she knew the station would never become a polished suburban home. She wanted to keep its identity, to live among the scars of its history, and to let its flaws shape her daily rhythm. She placed her bed under the old departure board, set her books along the ticket counter, and laid her sketch pads on benches where travelers once waited with their luggage. She told herself she was not just moving into a house, she was moving into a story, and that story deserved to be told through her art. The locals did not quite know what to make of her. On her first week, she tried greeting the neighbors across the tracks, a row of houses with tidy lawns and porches, but the smiles she received felt guarded. One woman in particular, Karen Blake, seemed almost rehearsed in her friendliness. Karen walked over with a pie and a string of questions that sounded casual but were sharpened at the edges. How much had she paid for the station? Whether she intended to open it to the public? If she was aware of the heritage value of the site? Maya thanked her, tried to explain her vision of creating a private but creative retreat, and saw in Karen's eyes a flicker of something that was not approval but calculation, as though the woman was already slotting this information into some scheme. She had been nurturing. Maya brushed off the unease, convincing herself it was only the inevitable friction of being the outsider in a place where everyone seemed to know each other's business. But the way Karen's gaze lingered on the arched windows gave her a sense that she was being assessed not as a neighbor but as a resource. In the evenings, Maya would sit on the platform steps with a thermos of tea, watching freight trains rumble in the distance, feeling both completely detached from the city and oddly connected to its hidden arteries. The air smelled of rust and wet stone, the silence broken by the occasional shout from the nearby scrapyard, and she thought of how many thousands of strangers had once paused here on their way to somewhere else. She began sketching new installations inspired by the station. Huge papier-mâché clocks, fabric banners painted with fragments of timetables, light sculptures that flickered like passing trains. She imagined one day inviting fellow artists for residencies, turning the disused rooms into studios. It was a fragile dream, but it kept her moving through the exhaustion of sealing leaks and clearing debris. At night, lying under the tall ceiling beams, Maya sometimes wondered why she had not chosen something simpler, why she had traded comfort for a building that creaked in the wind. But she always came back to the same answer. This place made her feel anchored. She had spent years creating illusions for audiences who forgot them the moment the curtain fell. But here she could build something that endured, something that bore the weight of time instead of pretending it did not exist. She had no idea that to her neighbor Karen, The very same building represented not a sanctuary but an opportunity, and that the battle over what the station was and what it would become was only just beginning, hidden for now beneath the polite small talk and the passing glances, waiting to erupt the moment someone decided to claim it as their own. The first weeks in the station passed in a rhythm Maya found both exhausting and strangely exhilarating, filled with dust, plaster, the smell of turpentine, and the quiet triumph of seeing small corners come back to life under her hands. So when the envelope appeared on the heavy wooden door, one damp morning she thought it was just another circular from the city about utilities or a warning about the cracked sidewalk. The paper was crisp, neatly folded, and slipped into the gap between the door and the iron latch, and when she opened it her eyes caught a phrase that made her chest tighten. Your upcoming guest reservation. At first she laughed out loud, assuming some bureaucratic mistake had dropped another person's letter in her doorway, but the more she read, the less sense it made. The document was a printed confirmation from a booking platform, welcoming Karen's guest house into its community of unique properties and notifying the host that a couple from Toronto would be arriving on Saturday to enjoy a restored vintage train station, curated with authentic character and atmospheric charm. The address listed was hers. The photos embedded in the document were hers as well, or rather, the station's, clearly taken from outside the fence during the months before she had moved in. Wide shots of the facade, the arched doors, the platform half choked with weeds, and the name of the host, in bold letters, was Karen Blake. For several minutes Maya stood frozen in the half-lit entrance hall, reading and rereading the paper until the words seemed to blur into nonsense. But no matter how many times she checked, it was undeniable that someone was offering her building to strangers as though it belonged to them. She tore through her memory, trying to recall every conversation with Karen, but beyond the superficial chat on that first afternoon, there had been nothing substantial, no hint of permission granted, no discussion of rentals. The sheer audacity of seeing the station packaged as a product, presented to travelers as an experience to be purchased, made her feel sick, as if a line she had not even known existed had been crossed. She wanted to believe it was some glitch, that perhaps the address was wrong or the platform had auto-generated an error, but the precision of the photographs left little doubt. Someone had gone out of their way to create this listing, and that someone was her neighbor. She considered calling the number on the document, but before she could even decide, Saturday arrived and with it the sound of rolling luggage over gravel. Maya, sitting at her makeshift desk by the ticket window, looked up to see a couple in their 30s approaching with confident smiles. They waved as if they were meeting a host. "Hi, we're here for our stay," the man said, adjusting his backpack straps. Karen said the key would be waiting. Maya felt her throat go dry. She stepped outside, explaining haltingly that she was the owner, that the station was her home, not a guest house. The woman frowned in confusion, holding up her phone to show the reservation screen. Maya saw her station framed in glossy filters, with a caption describing it as a one-of-a-kind overnight adventure in industrial history. The couple insisted they had already paid, that Karen had answered their emails personally, and, to Maya's astonishment, they described details of the interior as if they had been inside. The tiled floor, the long wooden benches, the clock that no longer worked. "We stayed here once before," the man added casually. "Last summer, it was rustic, but magical." His words struck Maya harder than the papers had. Last summer the building had been sealed and abandoned. If they had stayed, it could only have been through someone illegally opening the place. That meant Karen had not just listed it now, she had been running this operation for months, maybe years, before Maya ever signed her deed. When the couple finally left, grumbling about refunds, Maya locked the heavy door with trembling hands and sat against the cold stone wall, trying to piece together the enormity of what she had just learned. It was not just a question of a fraudulent listing. It meant the identity of the station itself had been manipulated. presented to outsiders not as a home or a heritage site, but as a commercial curiosity. To the world of guests and tourists, Karen was already the host, the gatekeeper, the person with authority, while Maya, its legal owner, was a nameless intruder disrupting their vacation. The inversion of roles made her dizzy. She imagined all the footsteps that had crossed her floors without permission, all the strangers who had slept under the roof she now called her sanctuary, each of them thinking they were legitimate guests in a business arrangement, not participants in an elaborate trespass. It made her question the very reality of her ownership, as though paper deeds and auction records were flimsy shields against the stories others chose to tell about the place. That night, she tried to shake off the encounter by working late, painting a canvas that echoed the long arches of the windows, but every creak of the building unsettled her. Every shadow felt like it concealed another uninvited visitor. Near midnight, a car slowed outside, headlights sweeping across the facade, and she heard voices murmuring, someone testing the gate latch before driving away. She could not sleep, her imagination filling with the idea of arriving guests who believed they belonged there more than she did. In the morning, she walked to the fence and found a slip of paper tied to the iron bars. It was a handwritten note. "Welcome, travelers. Use side door, Karen." The words were jaunty, as if scribbled in a rush, but the implication was chilling. It was not a mistake, not an accidental overlap. Karen was actively sending people into her space, instructing them on how to enter, treating Maya's home as a stage for her own enterprise. Maya considered confronting her directly, marching across the tracks and demanding an explanation, but something in her gut told her it would not be a conversation. It would be a trap, one she was not yet prepared to step into. Instead, she folded the note and placed it beside the printed confirmation. Two pieces of evidence that her sense of reality was not betraying her. The station was hers, and yet someone else had claimed the story of it. And stories, she was beginning to realize, could be more powerful than deeds. Maya told herself she could not continue in a state of paralyzed shock, that she needed to understand the scale of what Karen had been doing, so she began to ask quiet questions among the few neighbors who would still exchange words with her, but the answers she received unsettled her more than silence ever could. An older man trimming hedges across the tracks shrugged when she asked if he knew about strangers at the station, saying that for at least 2 summers he had seen weekenders carrying coolers and sleeping bags through the side gate, assuming they were part of some city program or perhaps friends of the previous caretaker. A younger woman walking her dog told Maya she had once asked Karen about it directly and had been told that the station was a community site, temporarily managed by her, a phrase vague enough to slip under suspicion, but confident enough to discourage challenge. Listening to them, Maya realized that for the neighborhood at large, Karen had already established herself as the station's interpreter, weaving a narrative of stewardship that made Maya's sudden ownership look almost illegitimate, like she had broken into someone else's ongoing project. The confirmation of that inversion came one Friday evening when Maya, exhausted from scraping layers of old paint, heard the click of a suitcase handle dragging over the platform. She rushed to the door and found 2 travelers standing with the ease of people who believed they had every right to be there. They greeted her by name, not her real name, but the name Karen had apparently given them, calling her the caretaker actress, as though Maya herself were a role in some immersive theater experience. In their hands, they held a code slip with the 4 digits that unlocked her newly installed keypad, digits Maya herself had set, digits she had only told to her contractor. The only conclusion possible was that someone had come during her absence, reset the keypad, and shared the code with strangers, then reset it again before her return. The quiet violation made her stomach lurch. It meant her locks, her sense of safety, had already been undone. The travelers were confused when she explained that this was her residence, not a guest house. They looked at each other, uneasy but still half convinced that she was performing some scripted interaction, since the listing had described authentic encounters with the station's spirit. Their laughter turned to discomfort only when Maya demanded they leave immediately. As they walked away, muttering about reporting her to the platform, she realized with a chill that in their minds she was the intruder interfering with a legitimate contract. To them, Karen's words were more real than the deed Maya had signed. That night, she sat at her long work table under the broken departure board, spreading out the papers she had collected. The printed confirmation, the handwritten note, the code slip left behind by one of the guests. The pile looked thin and fragile compared to the weight of her dread. She thought of calling the police, but the idea of explaining that strangers were entering her home because her neighbor had advertised it as a tourist attraction felt absurd, like a complaint no officer would take seriously. The building itself worked against her. To the outside eye, it did not look like a home. It looked like an empty relic, and anyone could believe it was up for use. She sensed, with a bitterness that tasted of metal, that this was precisely Karen's advantage. 2 days later, she found the boldest sign yet. A group of 4 arrived at dusk, carrying grocery bags and a guitar case, cheerfully waving as though greeting their hostess. When she tried to stop them, they pulled up an email printed on paper, signed with Karen's name, promising them exclusive use of the Heritage Station for the weekend. They were indignant at being turned away, one of them threatening to leave a damaging review online. When they finally departed, Maya stood in the echoing hall shaking so hard she could barely lock the doors. The words exclusive use burned in her mind. Her ownership was being rewritten in real time, erased and replaced by a narrative she had no part in. The next morning she crossed the tracks, resolve hardening despite her dread, and knocked on Karen's front door. The woman appeared in a pressed blouse, her hair perfectly arranged, greeting Maya with exaggerated warmth. When Maya demanded an explanation, Karen tilted her head and spoke in a tone of rehearsed patience, insisting that she had simply helped keep the station active during years of abandonment, that locals had appreciated her initiative, and that Maya's sudden purchase did not erase the community's investment. She used phrases like shared history and collective stewardship, each one delivered with the assurance of someone used to being believed. Maya pressed her, accusing her of trespass and fraud, but Karen only smiled thinly and replied, "If you want to live in a landmark, expect people to want to share it." The conversation ended with Maya walking away, her fists clenched, her certainty cracking under the weight of Karen's brazen reinterpretation. That evening, unable to quiet her nerves, Maya checked the station's exterior and discovered fresh boot marks by the side gate. She followed them to the platform and found the remnants of a picnic: plastic cups, crumbs, a wine bottle left standing like a marker of triumph. It was no longer about guests arriving with bookings. It had become an open claim, an assumption that the building was available to anyone Karen directed. The sense of invasion spread into her dreams, filling them with images of strangers in her bed, strangers painting her walls, strangers looking at her sketches and laughing. She woke with her heart racing, realizing that this was the first escalation, not yet legal, not yet physical violence, but a corrosion of reality itself, a steady erasure of her boundaries until she began to doubt whether they had ever been there, Hattie. Maya had always believed that physical evidence spoke louder than words, that papers and records carried weight no one could deny, but the longer the conflict with Karen stretched on, the more she realized that evidence alone was meaningless if the story around it had already been captured by someone else. The visitors who arrived at her station each weekend came armed not only with emails and access codes, but with an expectation carefully crafted by her neighbor. And that expectation turned every interaction into a theater of disbelief, where Maya, the rightful owner, was cast as the antagonist in someone else's play. It wore her down, night after night, until she began to feel that the station itself was sliding away from her, its walls listening more to Karen's voice than to her own. Still, she knew she needed something irrefutable, something that could shift the balance, and that meant digging deeper than the casual notes and printouts she had collected. One gray morning, with rain dripping through the roof and pooling on the mosaic floor, she climbed into the old records room above the ticket hall, a dusty chamber she had avoided since moving in because of the smell of mildew and the clutter of broken cabinets. She forced open drawers swollen with damp, pulling out folders filled with brittle papers, contracts from the railway company, city notices, receipts from decades past. Hours slipped by as she sifted through the detritus of bureaucracy, and just when she was ready to give up, her hand brushed against a leather-bound binder marked Transfer and Auction. Inside were copies of deeds and transactions, the very documents that had brought the station into public ownership before the auction where she had purchased it. At the back, stapled to a thin sheet of correspondence, she found a note in the city clerk's hand confirming that no private management entity had legal claim to the property after its closure. The words were plain and unadorned, but they struck her like a bell. Proof that whatever role Karen had pretended to play as a steward, it had never been recognized by the authorities. Clutching the binder like a shield, Maya contacted an acquaintance from her days in the theater world, a lawyer named Amelia Reyes who had helped artists navigate disputes over gallery spaces. Amelia met her at the station the following afternoon, walking slowly through the cavernous hall, her eyes taking in the iron columns and broken windows with quiet calculation. She listened as Maya recounted everything, the bookings, the codes, the guests, the confrontation, and when she finally spoke, her tone was measured but firm. "This isn't just trespassing," Amelia said. "This is appropriation. She's created a parallel narrative of ownership, and she's monetized it. If she's using your property for financial gain without your consent, that's grounds for legal action." Maya felt a rush of relief mixed with dread, because while the words confirmed her instincts, they also meant the fight would no longer be confined to her own endurance. It would spill into courtrooms and committees, places where Karen's confident performance could carry as much weight as truth. The first sign of how tangled it would become appeared when Amelia tried to file an injunction. Within days, a notice arrived suspending certain renovations at the station due to a pending review of historical designation. Maya stared at the letter in disbelief. She had checked thoroughly before the auction. The station was not on any register of heritage sites, yet now the city claimed that an application was under consideration, filed by none other than Karen Blake. In her petition, Karen had described the station as a community cultural resource, citing her own tours and events as evidence of its significance. She had listed herself as curator and coordinator. The audacity was breathtaking, but what unnerved Maya more was the subtle genius of the move. By framing the station as heritage, Karen was not claiming ownership outright. She was claiming authority, inserting herself as the gatekeeper through which any future use must pass. Amelia studied the petition and frowned. "She's trying to freeze you," she said. "If this designation goes through, you'll be forced to get approvals for every repair, every change. She can delay you indefinitely while keeping her narrative alive." Maya felt anger coil in her chest, but before she could respond, Amelia added, "The good news is, this petition is weak. It's built entirely on her own activities, not on official recognition. If we can show that her events were unauthorized, we can discredit her." The following weekend, as if to mock Maya's fragile hope, another group arrived at the gates. This time, they were not ordinary tourists, but a cluster of graduate students from a design school in Chicago, brimming with enthusiasm and cameras, telling Maya that they were here to document the Living Heritage Project run by Karen. They spoke of it as if it were already an institution, an established collaboration between community and academia. One even handed Maya a printed syllabus referencing the East Bridge Station Living Memory Project, with Karen Blake listed as community partner. Maya's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, realizing how far the lie had spread, that it was no longer confined to vacation rentals, but had embedded itself in educational programs and grant applications. The students looked at her with puzzled expressions when she tried to explain that she was the owner and that no such project existed. They laughed nervously, apologizing for the mix-up, but she could see in their eyes the same hesitation she had seen in the tourists, doubt about who she really was. That night, she could not bring herself to sleep inside the station. She sat instead on the wet platform under the weak glow of a streetlight. The binder of deeds pressed to her chest and wondered how long it would take before even she began to question whether she belonged there. The walls loomed above her like witnesses to a trial where the verdict had already been decided. She thought of her grandfather, who had worked on railways his entire life, and asked herself whether she was strong enough to keep fighting for a building that seemed determined to slip away from her. But then she remembered the look on the students' faces, the ease with which they had accepted Karen's authority, and something hardened inside her. If stories could override reality, then she would have to fight with stories as well as with deeds. The turning point came the following week when Amelia returned with news. She had tracked down records of small grants Karen had received from a local cultural foundation, claiming to run pop-up residencies at the station. In one report, Karen had even submitted photographs of artists working inside the building, photographs that Maya recognized with a jolt as stolen from her own blog years earlier. The fraud was laid bare, undeniable in its brazenness. "This is it," Amelia said, tapping the papers. "She's not just overstepping. She's stealing identities, using other people's work to cement her story. If we present this, we can dismantle her credibility." Maya looked at the forged report and felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time in months, she saw a crack in Karen's edifice, a place where truth could slip through. As she prepared to gather more evidence, Maya realized that this was no longer just about protecting her home. It was about reclaiming reality itself from someone who had learned how easily it could be rewritten. She knew the road ahead would be brutal, filled with hearings, challenges, and more attempts to erase her presence, but in that moment she felt the station breathe with her, as though the walls themselves were waiting for her to speak on their behalf. The midpoint had arrived, and with it the first glimpse that Karen's story, however persuasive, was not invincible. The weeks after Amelia uncovered Karen's fraudulent grant reports should have given Maya confidence, but instead they ushered in a darker phase of the struggle, one where every step forward was met with a blow from another direction, and where the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift according to her neighbors' whims. If Karen had once confined herself to opportunistic rentals and invented titles, she now escalated into open obstruction, leveraging every institution she could reach to make Maya's daily life unbearable. It began with a notice from the city's building department, citing community complaints about unsafe renovations at the station and ordering an inspection. Maya knew instantly who had filed the complaints, but the inspector who arrived did not care about motives. He walked through her half-repaired rooms with a clipboard, making notes about exposed wiring and scaffolding without permits, and issued fines that drained her small reserve of funds. She argued that all of it had been temporary, work in progress under her ownership, but the man shrugged and said, "File an appeal if you want. Someone clearly doesn't like what you're doing." Not long after, flyers began appearing on telephone poles around the neighborhood, grainy photos of the station with captions warning of illegal construction endangering heritage property. At first, Maya tore them down, but new ones replaced them within hours, as if an invisible hand was determined to keep the story alive. She saw neighbors whispering, looking at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, and realized Karen had mobilized them, feeding them a steady diet of fear about the loss of a supposed community treasure. It no longer mattered that the station had been abandoned for decades. Under Karen's narrative, it was suddenly sacred, and Maya was the reckless outsider desecrating it. One evening, she returned from buying groceries to find her front gate chained with a lock she did not own. A sign hung from the iron bars, "Closed for public safety." Coordinator's order. The arrogance of the gesture made her laugh bitterly, but it also forced her to call a locksmith in the dark while curious neighbors watched from their porches. By the time the chain was cut and the sign thrown aside, Maya's humiliation was complete. The message was clear. Karen could trespass into her reality at will, and the community would see her resistance not as defense, but as disruption. Amelia urged her to keep gathering evidence, reminding her that the fraudulent grants and false reports were powerful weapons if used correctly. Yet Maya felt the slow erosion of her strength. Each night new disturbances arose. Footsteps outside, unfamiliar cars idling at odd hours, scraps of paper slid under her door with mocking slogans like, "Share the history," or "Caretakers, not owners." She never saw Karen place them, but she could. Imagine her standing with that practiced smile, spinning the story to whoever would listen, while Maya sat inside feeling more like a squatter in her own home. The worst moment came when another group of supposed guests arrived. Not casual tourists this time, but a family with 2 children. They carried blankets and snacks, convinced they had rented the place for a weekend retreat. When Maya told them the listing was fraudulent, the father grew angry, accusing her of trying to scam them, shouting loud enough for the neighbors to gather. The children cried, the mother pleaded, and the spectacle turned Maya into a villain in her own doorway. Later, she would learn that Karen had told the family to ignore the resident artist who sometimes pretends she lives there, reframing Maya's reality as part of the package. The cruelty of it left her shaking for hours, unable to hold a brush or pen. That night, she sat with Amelia, who laid out the strategy for the coming legal battle: present the grant fraud, challenge the heritage petition, and force the city to acknowledge Maya's ownership. It sounded logical, but Maya confessed in a whisper that she no longer trusted logic. She had watched how quickly perception shifted, how easily strangers accepted Karen's authority, and she feared that even in a courtroom the performance would outweigh the truth. Amelia placed a hand on hers and said, "Then we'll have to make our truth louder." As if to answer that defiance, the next morning Maya discovered the station's side wall splashed with paint. Crude words scrawled in red, "Not yours." She stared at the dripping letters, half graffiti, half verdict, and realized the conflict had crossed into open hostility. It was no longer about paperwork or bookings, it was about identity itself, about who had the right to define what the station was. For Karen, escalation meant pressing until Maya broke, until she abandoned the building and left the narrative uncontested. For Maya, escalation meant finding a way to endure the constant invasion, to hold her ground even as it crumbled beneath her. Standing before the scarred wall, her fists clenched, Maya knew the fight had only just reached its most dangerous stage. The court date arrived not with the dramatic thunder Maya had imagined, but with the sterile quiet of fluorescent hallways, the shuffle of papers, and the low murmur of clerks calling names. She sat at the long table with Amelia, the binder of deeds heavy in front of her, while Karen took her place across the aisle, immaculate as always in a pale blazer and pearls, her expression calm and faintly amused, as if she were attending a social luncheon rather than a legal hearing. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, and for a moment Maya felt absurd, as though all the months of torment, the visitors at her door, the vandalism, the relentless erosion of her sanity, might be dismissed in a few brisk words by a judge who had never seen the station's walls. But when proceedings began, the weight of it pressed down with a force that stole her breath. Karen's lawyer spoke first, weaving a narrative as smooth as silk, describing his client as a dedicated community advocate who had simply maintained an abandoned property when no one else would. He described her cultural programs, her supposed partnerships with schools, her tireless efforts to keep the heritage alive. He gestured to printouts of flyers and testimonials, many of which Maya knew were forged or twisted from half-truths, but the confidence with which he spoke made them sound unassailable. Karen sat perfectly still, hands folded, the very image of patient stewardship. Maya felt her chest tighten as she watched heads nod in the gallery, as though the story she had been living, the intrusions, the fear, the graffiti, were invisible beside this polished performance. When it was their turn, Amelia rose with calm authority, her voice sharper, less adorned, but carrying the weight of evidence. She laid out the fraudulent grant applications, pointing to photographs Karen had stolen from Maya's portfolio. Photographs the court could compare directly to dated online postings that predated Karen's claims. She presented the city's own correspondence confirming that no caretaker agreement had ever existed, only abandonment until the auction. Finally, she called witnesses. Two of the tourists who had unwittingly stayed at the station and later realized they had been misled. One testified that he had been told Maya was an actress playing a role, a statement that drew audible murmurs of disbelief from the room. Another admitted that he had paid cash directly to Karen. No receipts, no contracts, only promises. For the first time, Karen's mask flickered, her lips pressing into a thin line, her eyes darting toward her attorney. The climax came when Amelia submitted the vandalism photographs alongside the handwritten notes Karen had left for guests. The judge studied them in silence, then looked directly at Karen and asked if she had written the words instructing visitors to use the side door. Karen hesitated a fraction too long, and in that silence the entire edifice of her authority seemed to falter. The judge leaned back, voice steady but firm, declaring that the evidence demonstrated a clear pattern of unauthorized exploitation of Maya's property, a pattern that extended beyond misunderstanding into willful fraud. He ordered an immediate injunction against any further listings, mandated restitution for damages, and referred the matter to city prosecutors for review of financial improprieties. Maya heard the words but felt them more as a release of pressure than as triumph. The months of invasion, of questioning her own reality, did not dissolve in a single ruling, but the certainty that Karen's narrative had finally cracked gave her a breath she had not realized she had been holding for months. Karen remained composed as the decision was read, but her hands clenched the edge of the table, her nails digging into the polished wood, and Maya saw in her eyes for the first time not amusement, but fury. When they stepped out into the hall, Amelia squeezed her shoulder and said, "This isn't the end, but it's the turn. She can't undo this." Maya nodded, feeling the cold air from the courthouse doors on her face, the world outside still ordinary, cars passing, people laughing on the sidewalk. Yet for her, everything had shifted. The station was still fragile, still scarred, but now the law had spoken in her favor. She had not just defended a building. She had defended her place in the story. The weeks after the ruling passed with an uncanny quiet, as though the neighborhood itself had drawn in a breath and chosen not to release it. No more visitors arrived with luggage in tow, no more cars idled outside in the night, and the notes and flyers that once littered her gates vanished as if they had never existed. Karen retreated from sight, her curtains drawn, her garden untended, her name whispered with discomfort rather than admiration at the meetings of the community group she once commanded. The absence of her presence felt less like victory than like a strange hollow, a silence where tension had once thrived, and Maya found herself listening for echoes that no longer came. The station, for the first time since she had stepped inside, seemed to belong wholly to her, and yet the weight of that belonging felt heavier than she had imagined. She poured her energy back into restoration, not as a frantic defense but as a steady reclamation, sealing leaks, repainting walls, arranging her artwork in corners where the sunlight struck through cracked windows and fractured beams. Slowly, the space began to transform from contested territory into a true home, its scars still visible but no longer threatening. She hosted a small gathering of friends from the city, inviting them to walk through the halls and see what she had created, and when they marveled at the mixture of ruin and renewal, she felt a quiet pride unclouded by fear. Yet she also carried a sharper understanding that ownership was not merely a matter of papers or rulings, but a constant act of assertion, a refusal to let others define what was hers. On an early spring morning, she stood alone on the platform, watching a freight train thunder past in the distance, the sound reverberating through the iron beams like a memory of the building's former life. For the first time, she felt not like a defender holding on to something fragile, but like a custodian of her own choosing, one who had survived the theft of her story and reclaimed it with stubborn resolve. The station was hers, not because the court had said so, but because she had refused to surrender to the performance that tried to erase her. And as the rumble of the train faded into silence, she allowed herself a long breath, knowing the battle was over even if the scars remained. And that was enough.